I want to talk about effectiveness, as we have already done this morning, but with a slight difference. I think this morning we talked about effectiveness in connection with an FATF peer group review, where a whole country is assessed. What I want to focus on is effectiveness as it refers to individual banks. Now, if I look at my friends in the Wolfsberg Group, which are probably the 14 largest private banks in the world, they today employ somewhere between 1,000 and 9,000 people in financial crime compliance. If you multiply that by $100,000 per head, then you get a feeling for the financial dimension or the cost dimension we're talking about. You're talking about an expense block of somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion. Now, when I talk about effectiveness, the idea is not to reduce that cost, but when you spend so much money, you want to make sure that it is spent as effectively as possible. And we have some indications that some of the processes that relate to FCC could probably be improved so that we could get more effectiveness for those amounts spent. I want to give you 3 simple examples for lack of effectiveness. Take international payments. When you today originate a payment, it passes through your bank, you will probably have a regional bank, and then it goes to a central clearer, probably in New York, who then moves it on to another clearer, and then it gets to a regional bank. So this payment passes through 6 banks: the originator, the recipient's banks, and probably 4 intermediary banks. In the current regime, each of these banks has to filter and to screen all these payments. And whenever there are inconsistencies or suspicion in these payments, they will have to ask for information from the originator or from other banks involved. This means in this process we do the same thing 6 times, which cannot be productive. Of course, it has the advantage that when you do something 6 times and different banks do it, probably the outcome is better. But when you can agree on an international standard, then you would think that probably once screened properly would be enough, because doing it 6 times, that creates additional work, additional costs, and sometimes it does not improve the process because everybody relies on the others. But what we should also be aware is that the world of payments is changing. In today's world, we usually had 2 days settlement for those payments that travel around the world. SWIFT is now moving rapidly to immediate settlement, which means that they expect that a payment will be credited to the receiving bank within 5 minutes. So it is obvious that in those 5 minutes there is no time left for 6 times screening. So if we want to follow technology, we will automatically have to adapt the financial crime control process. The same applies when you look at new technology. All those internet-based fintech companies, they now over PayPal, they offer payments instantaneously. Some of the MSPs offer instant payment. And therefore the traditional financial sector, sometimes due to the burden of financial crimes control, is no longer competitive with their environment. And we have to increase effectiveness to protect competitiveness. If you look at SARS, RUSI in the United Kingdom have recently done a study where they came to the conclusion that of the SARS filed, some say 20%, others say 10%, are properly looked at by financial intelligence units. So you can ask yourself with justification, why do we need to file the remaining 90% of those SARS? And it is certainly worthwhile to analyze that question to improve the effectiveness of this SARS filing process. However, that needs in our view, a change in that we cooperate more with the public sector. That comes and leads us to PPP. But that also means that this cannot be a one-way street. As with FATF reviews, the private sector and the individual banks want to discuss with regulators, supervisors, what they are really expected to deliver to be first in class. What is missing today is clear instructions from the regulators by which means effectiveness of a bank's financial crime compliance can effectively be measured. You've got certain goals, but there is no really objective measurement, and a lot of the assessment that we see today is really subjective. But banks really want to know what they have to do that they are considered to have this done properly. To come back to SARS, we had times in Switzerland, we have always had a pretty low reporting number of SARS. However, 80% of those SARS went on to law enforcement, so we had a very, very high effectivity rate when it came to SAR filing, because 80% of those SARS were considered valuable to law enforcement and finally ended up in the courts. But Switzerland came under constant pressure to not having filed enough SARS because they compared not so favorable with countries that had very high numbers of SARS. Or to put it in another way, I remember a circular letter by FinCEN, the American FIU, where in the first paragraph they criticized the banks for not filing enough SARS. And in the second paragraph, they criticized the banks for filing so-called defensive SARS, which is another word for filing too many SARS. Now, this is the great art of high diplomacy, but if you're at the receiving end of those circular letters, it's not very helpful. And therefore, I think when you talk about creating effectivity, there is a justification that you ask, what are you really expecting from me? And banks think when they should file more SARS, fine, we can do that. But then it should also be expected that in this production line where the SARS go to an FIU and then to law enforcement, the whole production line should work at the same capacity. It cannot be that the bank produce something that then hits lack of capacity in the FIUs or in law enforcement. So therefore, we should think more across the barriers, should think the processes from the beginning, and that is the crime, to the end, because the overall measurement for the effectiveness should be how much crime or how much more crime can we detect thanks to the FCC process. How many people in the end are prosecuted and how much money is confiscated. That is the final outcome. And there, unfortunately, if we look at the history in the world, we have not made very much progress. Some would say that we have kept crime, organized crime, drug dealing a bit better under control, but the idea that following the money would solve the problems of international crime, I think needs to be rethought. Internal information sharing, originally banks had very decentralized systems. They are now working on centralized systems, but they come to limits to share cross-border information. And if you're working at a bank, you know how complicated it is to get a company or a group-wide view on a client, because it's not easy to identify the client and add this all up. And in many instances, you're still confronted with privacy regulations that stop you from exchanging that information. External information sharing, I think banks have made great progress in that they are giving information to regulators, in that they are filing SARS, and that they are now exchanging tax information, which is really the end of banking secrecy, because whenever you have a foreign client now in Switzerland, you will have to inform the foreign tax authorities of that client about his income and his wealth with your bank. So the banks have done a lot to share. On the other hand, the banks have also received information. Look at the terrorist list, look at the sanctions lists, which I think banks can now work on very well, and they are performing well under this. We have also seen in the fight against terrorism that when a terrorist act happens and the police have identified that the terrorists, banks can now deliver, or most banks can deliver within 24 hours, a lot of information, historic information on those terrorists. So there we have a very good cooperation. But if the public sector expects banks to go further in the fight against crime, then probably we should find ways how the public sector can share more information with the private sector. This is done in sandbox exercises, as Jay will say, in the United States, and with Gimlet in the UK, where structures have been shared and where even names have been shared. And this has proven very successful in a kind of test phase. Where this can be rolled out as an overall system is to be seen, but I think there's general hope and expectation that the public sector, if it wants to have more from banks, the banks should receive relevant information. This also means that banks should be allowed to exchange more information among themselves. Currently, banks are forbidden to exchange information. If you go to the insurance industry, they usually have central registers for wrongdoers. You find similar structures in the banking industry in some countries when it comes to the creditworthiness of clients, in particular in the retail business. But generally, banks are hindered by privacy to check with their colleagues in other banks what they think about the same client, or to act in a coordinated way. Again, Gimlet, for example, is now a platform where certain issues, such as dealing with Russian sanctions or others, can be discussed in a closed shop, and where banks can share information among each other. But it becomes more difficult when you get down to clients and when you get down to names. One solution is here, as tried in the United States, is that banks are given names and then they report to a central independent unit that then aggregates those informations and looks whether something can be done with that. This gets us close to utilities. We have now at least two examples for working utilities. One is the so-called KYC utility that was started by SWIFT to allow banks worldwide to upload their information that is needed for client due diligence into that utility, so that they only have to supply this information once. And on the other hand, the correspondent banks, they can draw the information from that utility, and therefore they don't have to file this information themselves. You no longer have 2,000 banks chasing each other for information, but you put that into one central utility, which saves resources and, of course, tremendously improves the quality of the utility. SWIFT has also started to address de-risking, so-called screening services for smaller and medium-sized banks. But as I told you, the screening process currently is not very productive, and one should think about whether utilities could not be of a wider use when it comes to filtering and screening. In SAR reviews, and I've already touched on that, and I think Mr. Mansour mentioned it this morning, there's urgent need of a discussion between the public and the private sector, what is really needed, how much the public sector wants, of what quality, if we should have one system for a SAR, or whether there should probably be two levels for SARs. One is a profound SAR, where you might have a bigger case where it needs a lot of analysis, and the other becomes a kind of routine reporting, such as formerly just transaction reporting. So I think everybody should be invited to have a discussion with their FIUs and to build mutual trust. It is not to shift responsibility to the FIU, and it is not to make life easier for banks. It is just to improve the effectiveness of the system. RegTech and technical information will help us. But I have a warning here. I hear from all my friends that when they use RegTech, and that is technology to help you with financial crime compliance, for example, by applying machine learning or artificial intelligence to identify structures in your banks, can be very expensive. So in the beginning, you will not save money from that. You will have to spend money. My worry is that RegTech will be too expensive for smaller and medium-sized banks, and you don't have the resources and the capacities, and therefore this automatically will force you to join forces or to use utilities to apply that technical process. Counterterrorism and sanctions, I'm afraid, are here to stay. Even if the war against ISIS should be won, I don't think terrorism will go away, and we will see other forms. Banks are working on analyzing the data that they have about terrorist incidents, about the terrorists they have observed. But I can tell you it's extremely difficult, and I'm skeptical whether we will ever be in a position to foretell a terrorist act by analyzing financial transactions. It is difficult enough to identify past crimes, but to foretell future crimes I do not know. But there are some indications of behaviorism that might help us there. But again, the question is to the public sector. So far, the public sector only shares what I would call non-sensitive information. It takes the United Nations some time to get somebody on their securities list, and then it comes to the sector. But those names are usually known, and those terrorists know that they're on those lists, so they will avoid the financial system. Far more interesting are those who are suspected but not in the public domain yet. And the question is whether those could be observed, how they move in the financial system, but that needs mutual trust and ways how we can work together. And last but not least, all my friends tell me that cybercrime is on top of their lists, and that cybercrime will have a major impact on financial crime compliance, because everything that is related to cyber or to crypto, in a way, is connected to your bank, whether as a client or as a transaction, or because you are at the receiving end of criminal money that has been made through those methods. And therefore, I can only recommend to you that when you want to be as effective as you should be, that you have somebody in your compliance department or financial crime compliance department who knows about cyber, and you do a risk assessment of what cybercrime could mean to you. To sum up, I think it is important for everybody that, in view of the monies and the resources we are spending on financial crime compliance, that we can make sure that this money is spent as effectively as possible, and that we cross borders to the public sector, establish mutual trust, and see this as a common challenge to all of us. Thank you very much.